Welcome to Beyond the Show, the podcast home of all things Cannabis Conference. My name is Eric Sandy, and I'm the digital editor of the Cannabis Group at GIE Media. Over at CannabisBusinessTimes.com, we've been publishing a number of features lately about price compression in the U.S. cannabis market. While each state market may have its own supply chain nuances, this broader economic issue seems fairly universal as cannabis, still federally illegal, mind you, comes into its own. Check out our reporting, and as always, please feel free to drop us a line with story tips or thoughts on how we might best approach a topic like this. To further home in on the price compression story, I spoke with Rick Maturo, BDSA's Director of Insights and Analytics, who was able to share some helpful data points that might illuminate how we can think about these ongoing trends. Supply is up in most states, but demand is too. And inflation is ravaging the consumer economy outside of cannabis. So what gives? The industry finds itself in a unique position in 2023, and all signs point to a slow-moving market correction as this year unfolds. As Meg Sanders, CEO of Canna Provisions in Massachusetts, recently told me, it's time to reconsider your business strategy. Don't rely on what worked in previous years. Rethink the way you do business. It's not all doom and gloom, but it's not the cheeriest moment in cannabis either. That said, please enjoy my conversation with Rick Maturo. Hello, Rick, and thanks so much for joining the show this week. It's great to get a chance to talk with you about some of these very timely and pertinent economic issues across the cannabis industry. One phrase being price compression. And I feel like, just speaking for myself, it's hard to turn around anymore without running into some story about price compression or some bit of data that exemplifies this price compression. So I wanted to begin our conversation today with, well, I suppose that phrase, price compression. Is this a fairly universal theme that we're seeing across the U.S. markets, as fragmented as they are in other ways, or are some states seeing more of this downward pressure than others?
Hey, Eric. Yeah, thank you so much for having me on here. So just to address your question, we're definitely seeing it, pretty universally across the board, with all states, having seen the average retail price of a cannabis product, decline if we're looking at the fourth quarter from 2022 and comparing that to the same quarter a year ago. Certainly, there's different magnitudes within markets. Some are certainly seeing a little bit more of that price compression hitting them. Some are seeing a little bit less. But yeah, in general, what's definitely a universal factor. I would say probably the biggest differentiator, that we're seeing is kind of what that market landscape looks like in terms of the number of brands, number of products within certain categories that are playing there. And I would say, just as a general rule of thumb, one of the things that we've seen is that those markets that are much less concentrated, have a lot of different players, in the market relative. Those are the markets that tend to be hit a little bit harder with price compression, just because, there's more independent entities, kind of competing against each other, trying to all win out on price. And certainly, consumers have more choices available in those markets. So just as a general rule, that's kind of what we're seeing. Those more fragmented markets tend to be hit a little bit harder with price compression overall than some of those more concentrated markets.
Certainly. Yeah. I wanted to ask a bit about that split sort of, on one hand, you have what we've come to know as the legacy markets, which in general are some of the Western U.S. states that have had some sort of legal adult use market in place for a number of years. And then you have some newcomers, most of which are in the Midwest, Mid-Atlantic, New England. And I'm curious, since operators across the U.S. are kind of confronting this economic situation, is this a case where you see some of the newer market entrants, whether that be like a New Jersey or Missouri? I know some of these are very new adult use markets, where they have to sort of grow up fast and almost mature at a more rapid clip than say Oregon, 5 years ago.
Yeah, in general, we are seeing some of these newer markets that have come online maturing at a faster rate than what we've seen from some of those legacy markets. We'll say that when we speak specifically about New Jersey, we did actually see that average retail price, kind of bucked the trend there, and we actually saw an increase, from the second quarter of 2022 through the fourth quarter of 2022 in terms of that average retail price. Missouri, we did see that price compression hit pretty strong, throughout the year of 2022. So even though that's a newer adult use market, and I'm speaking specifically about Missouri before it launched adult use here, but we did see that price compression hitting, all 4 quarters for the 2022 there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was hoping to maybe ask you a bit about, maybe to push that point a little bit, to ask you about demand. I know, and I'm certainly no economics major or anything, but I know that price tends to derive from both supply and demand curves. And my understanding is that it's not like demand is decreasing. In fact, it may be increasing as a lot of these markets come online. So could you sort of maybe elaborate on what a lot of these markets are seeing on the demand side for cannabis?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, kind of just looking at those the most recent quarter that we just completed there, the fourth quarter of 2022, and comparing it to that same quarter in 2021. What I can kind of see here is that across the 14 markets that BDSA tracks, most of them did see increased demand. A couple of outliers there that did not see that increase in demand when we compare those two periods, despite seeing pretty strong price compression, would be California and Colorado, and then Oregon. So again, Eric, speaking to kind of the differences that we see between some of those more established legacy markets and some of the newer ones, certainly all 3 of those, California, Colorado, and Oregon, not seeing that ensuing increase in demand of units being sold despite those lower prices. I think kind of proves out that there's definitely a difference there when we talk about the maturity with markets.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I wanted to ask about I guess there are a number of different dichotomies here, legacy markets, new markets, another one, of course, being adult use versus medical. And maybe Missouri is a good example, maybe it's not, but I was wondering if you could maybe talk a bit about that, the differences between medical and adult use. Are medical markets insulated in any way from some of these pricing pressures?
Not necessarily. Certainly, if I look at some of the medical markets that BDSA tracks here, Missouri, looking at 2022, we did see that price change from the fourth quarter of 2022 versus the fourth quarter of 2021. Missouri was actually one of the markets that saw the highest decrease in the average price across all those cannabis products. So you're down about $6.75. If you're looking at just the average retail price of a cannabis product in the Missouri market. Same kind of story that we're seeing with Missouri happening in Pennsylvania. You're down about $6 if you're comparing that average retail price for a cannabis product from the fourth quarter of 2022 versus the fourth quarter of 2021. And kind of to just pile on there, Florida, another medical market that BDSA tracks, not far behind, down about $5.60, comparing kind of those two fourth quarter periods that I mentioned before. So definitely, those medical markets, are not insulated. On the contrary, they're seeing some more price compression than what we would expect, or than what we've seen in some of the adult use markets.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I know what we've been talking about so far is a bit of historical data, certainly some very recent historical data, but nonetheless, we're kind of looking back at the past year or so. But I know a lot of what BDSA does and a lot of what just the cannabis market is super interested in is or are market growth projections. And in general, I know that speaking generally, the projections for the cannabis market are kind of just an upward curve. There's a lot of growth to be had. These are still very, very early days for the cannabis market. But the status quo right now could certainly lead to some anxiety on the part of either existing operators or people who may be interested in getting into the market. So I just wanted to get a sense from you, generally speaking, about how projections for the next 1 to 5 years might be changing. Meaning, is this price compression a blip that we're going to need to navigate, or could this be a bit more of a market correction that could affect those several years worth of market outlooks.
Yeah, Eric, definitely can understand, why, anyone with an eye on the cannabis industry would want to be cognizant of, what BDSA is thinking the market's going to do going forward. I guess I can just say that, we're definitely expecting that this price compression that we saw, certainly in 2022 and even before that, is likely to continue at least into 2023. We're not really predicting that those prices are going to return to those past COVID era highs in 2023. The only thing that kind of buck that trend is if we see some very significant mitigating factors that, frankly, are just not very likely to happen. I'm talking, fall off of 80% of the supply that's available there, so there's very little supply going on, or maybe one brand kind of just going in and buying out any and all of its competitors. So again, not very likely to happen. What I can say, though, in terms of growth for the future, you're absolutely right. It's certainly an upward trajectory. We're still very excited about what the future holds for the U.S. market in particular. But gotta say, those strong growth numbers for some of those legacy markets, that we were seeing in previous years, those are certainly going to slow. Most of the growth that you're going to see, at least through 2027, is primarily going to be coming from some of those newer markets that are coming online, specifically those markets in the Northeast. And then some of those other large medical markets converting to adult use, or rather that BDSA is predicting to turn to adult use. And when I talk about markets in the Northeast, specifically I'm really talking about kind of, I want to say the elephant in the room, but New York. Obviously there's been some soft starts and a little bit of challenge, I think, getting that market online. Certainly I think people were predicting that maybe we'd be a little bit further down the road than what we're seeing today. I think I saw they just had opened the third dispensary in New York City. Mm-hmm. But definitely looking to New York and New Jersey, to be strong factors for growth in the Northeast. And then certainly, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention, some of those large medical markets that BDSA also tracks as well. So certainly, we're predicting that Florida by 2027, will have an open and operational adult use market. Pennsylvania, will certainly join the fold probably earlier than Florida, perhaps. So those two markets coming online, will also add, pretty strong growth to top line numbers. But if you're, someone, who's expecting a ton of growth from some of those legacy markets, you may want to just temper, some of those expectations. Especially if I just kind of look at those compound annual growth rates. Specifically, if I just been looking at kind of a cohort of some of those most mature markets, that we covered in the past year. I'm thinking about states like California, Colorado, Nevada, Oregon. Obviously, very strong markets traditionally, but we're really seeing those compound annual growth numbers really being in kind of those low to mid single digits there, versus I think about what those same CAGRs would be through 2026 with some of those newer and emerging markets that we just mentioned. Pennsylvania, we're predicting it's going to be double-digit growth. New Jersey, same thing, double-digit growth, probably in the mid to low 30s in terms of that CAGR. Missouri, a market that, we were talking about a little bit earlier, also going to be a strong growth market there, about 35% or so in terms of that CAGR through 2026. And then even Florida, could reach a 20% CAGR or so, through 2026. So definitely, I think if you're looking for where that growth's going to come from, just to reiterate, definitely look at some of those new and emerging markets, and, don't expect to see as strong of growth in some of the more established legacy markets.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting trend that's starting to reveal itself here in the U.S. And I know a lot of what we're talking about here, for obvious reasons, pertains to data and trends that we can plot on over time. But I'm curious, for so long in cannabis, it seems like California has been something of a leader in the market, or even a tastemaker. You have a lot of brands that are almost incubating in California, and then they eventually reach other markets either through acquisitions or MSO growth from California and beyond. But I'm curious if we're going to see more rapid growth in some of these newer markets, if we might expect some more homegrown brands to become either competitive with California-based brands or to take on a character of their own and maybe not lean so heavily on California in the cannabis market? If that question makes sense, I guess I kind of see, especially with New York, not that California is going to be dethroned as this massive market in the U.S. anytime soon. But I'm curious if we're going to start seeing some significant brands emerging from some of these newer markets.
Yeah, Eric, I think it's definitely a mixed bag. I mean, certainly in some of these newer markets, there is definitely an appetite to bring successful brands from other markets into some of those newer and emerging markets. There's definitely an appetite for that. And in fact, you're already starting to see some of those brands popping up in some of these earlier markets. But definitely, I think there's certainly an appetite, to get some of those homegrown brands, growing and seeing some of that same success as well. Hard to say if some of the homegrown ones will be able to match some of the success of the brands that we've seen in California and other legacy markets, but definitely I think there's something to be said about some of those smaller, more independent brands, or even brands that are owned by some of those larger brand houses in some of those newer markets. What they can do. Certainly here, I think people's eyes are still on California and what's all going on there in terms of new products being put into market and new product SKUs being tested in that market. But I think you probably will eventually start to see some of that attention shift again to some of those Northeast markets. Even some of the larger Midwestern markets, I think, are looking to make their own stake in terms of brands. So kind of a mixed bag there.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, I wanted to turn, or maybe zoom in rather, on the retail segment in particular. And one thing I've noticed in adult use and medical markets alike is that you see a lot of these weekly deals or various promotions that go on. And certainly there are all the obvious cannabis industry holidays, but even throughout a typical week, you see a lot of retailers lowering prices on certain products. Given all the price compression we've been talking about, could you maybe elaborate on whether or not that common retail strategy is super effective at this point, or if retailers might want to rethink how they market their products?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those discounts and those promotions, by and large, definitely do catch consumers' attentions. Certainly I'd be misspeaking if I said that I certainly was not also keeping an eye on those, for my own personal self, as well as just from the industry standpoint. But gotta say, I think retailers and brands, and certainly, folks are getting more adept at this, but I think they really need to understand kind of the numbers and what's going on behind some of those discounts and promotions. Because one of the things that we've seen is there's an appetite to want to, really kind of reach that lowest price possible for folks. And again, that can certainly increase units in some cases, but some of the cases that we looked at here at BDSA is that in some cases retailers may be discounting a little bit too much to the point that they don't need to go that low to still see that increased demand that we spoke to a little bit earlier in the conversation. So for anyone tuning in and listening in, I would definitely want you to think about kind of what those numbers are and really start to understand if you need to discount as far as you're going to see that same level of demand. And certainly that's the type of work that we're helping clients out with on a daily basis here. But in general, I think you don't always need to go as low as maybe some are thinking. And I think sometimes it's trying to beat your neighbor out, and ultimately it's kind of a lose-lose for everyone because that price doesn't need to be as low to still see that increased demand in some cases.
Yeah, certainly. I know, of course, we've been talking mainly about the business side of this equation, but for consumers and patients, this pricing trend may be an exciting thing for all the obvious reasons. Price being one of the major factors that goes into a buying decision, along with the perennial THC percentage driving all sorts of flower purchases, But of course, pricing can't be the only thing, and may not even be the most important thing for a lot of consumers. Are there other factors, whether that's product categories or even brands, that you might suggest retailers try to highlight when they're talking with consumers to maybe get them not thinking about price so much as consumption method or brand, things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely spot on there, Eric. Some of the top drivers that consumers are looking at are certainly, that high THC content, that taste and flavor profile, and then certainly price. And we don't really see much differentiation whether someone's a new consumer or, they've been in the category for a really long time. One of the things that I think brands also need to realize is that, we are seeing a lot of brand loyalty going on. I think that really traces down to, the value that some of these brands are able to put out, with their assortment of products. So I would say if you're really looking to drive business to a specific brand or to your specific brand, I would think very strongly about what the value proposition is for each of the products in your assortment. You need to go category by category or brand by brand, and really start to understand how the value proposition that each product is in the market there can provide for consumers. So, if you've done a bang up job of really selecting some strong strains and cultivars that are really going to help people out with certain needs that they may have, definitely I think highlighting some of that can be important. Same thing with minor cannabinoids and terpene profiles. We've seen a pretty strong shift where we're seeing a lot of some of the leading brands as well as even some of the smaller brands really starting to highlight some of those differences that they put into the market in terms of their formulation, their extraction method, or even flavor and terpene profiles that the products have. So any of those value propositions or attributes rather that these products have, I think are definitely worth highlighting. And at the same end, it's also important to do that because I think that sometimes consumers, have a lot of choice, and if those differences aren't clearly articulated to them, they may think that your product is very similar to a competitor's product, when in actuality, your product is very differentiated. So really kind of leaning in on what those different attributes are, what the value each product can bring, I think can definitely help consumers to understand why a certain product might be a better fit for them than not. And still, even things like packaging, can signal, value to consumers as well. So definitely thinking about things like that, social equity and, pro-social behaviors on behalf of brands, can go a long way. People want to feel good about the products that they're consuming and feel like the brands that they're supporting are also putting good out into the industry and the world at large. So, don't discount those little things that brands are doing there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly much more holistic than simply the economics of pricing here. And so I wanted to maybe wrap with this question. We're talking a lot about pricing trends, and certainly cannabis operators of all stripes are going to be watching closely in their own market and beyond their own market. But are there other trends that you might point operators to have them keep an eye on some segment of the industry over the next 12 months that might provide some important lessons that maybe they're not paying super close attention to right now, and should shift their attention there over the next year or so?
Yeah, definitely. I think, SKU and assortment optimization is always going to be important to retailers, but I think in this very competitive environment, it's definitely something that I think needs to be paid even closer attention to, excuse me. And, there are a couple of product categories that, we've certainly, kept an eye on and seen some pretty tremendous growth with, as well as some different attributes of products as well. So, just thinking very high level here, that infused pre-roll category, has certainly, grown a lot. What we're seeing today is about a little more than a third of all pre-roll sales now across all the markets in aggregate, are coming from that infused pre-roll segment. So definitely, I think that's something to kind of keep an eye on. In terms of other attributes that I think retailers and brands may want to pay attention to and, learn to highlight for their consumers. Spoke to it a little bit earlier, but, any of those minor cannabinoids going into the product formulation, I think will be very important, especially for directing consumers toward what needs these products might be good for. Another thing too, and this is sort of specific to the edible category in this respect, but solventless infusions. We've seen some pretty strong growth in that solventless category, especially in the leading edible category like gummies and stuff. So that could also be something to keep in mind. And then just in general, I think tiering. Certainly, I think there's a growing number of consumers that are looking for very premium products that have some very specific attributes to them. Think about things like live rosin cartridges, for example. But that doesn't mean that you got to forget about kind of your value to your customer, or your customer that's really looking for that weight and that volume when they go in. So having something for everyone, I think, is going to be very important in being able to address those different wants and needs of the various consumers, regardless of what tier they're in or what their level of maturity with the category is. I think it's certainly something that I would hone in on for retailers.
Yeah, those are all great points, and bringing up solventless, it sort of rings close to home because it's been such an interesting subcategory to watch over the last year or so. And it's a great example because your average consumer is not just going to automatically suddenly ask for solventless products. It takes a certain amount of consumer education to even, be aware of what that means. And I know consumer education is something that comes up all the time when we're talking about retailers and what staffs can do when they're engaging with customers. But just a good reminder that as we're talking about pricing, that consumer education element is a huge part of that. Price is obviously super important, but cracking open some of that demand for something like a solventless edible line, it takes a little bit of work to get to that point, and it's exciting when it does happen.
Yeah, absolutely, and certainly we're seeing a lot of education happening at various touch points throughout the industry, but I still think the same point stands true today that it did years ago, that the best education piece and probably the first line of defense for brands and retailers is making sure that they're being led by kind of those frontline workers there, your salespeople that are at the counter engaging with consumers on a daily basis, because certainly whether you're a new consumer or you're an advanced consumer, having questions being able to be answered by those salespeople at the point of sale, I think is, invaluable. Not to say that people aren't trying to do their research, and, certainly we're seeing a growing number of consumers, doing research before they even get into the store. But at the same time, those sales folks, can certainly drive decisions and ultimately, I think, help consumers make a more informed and ultimately a better decision with their input.
Absolutely. Well, Rick, it was great getting a chance to talk to you about some of these fairly urgent issues, but also some of these more timeless issues too, affecting the cannabis industry. And it's great to get BDSA's perspective on this, both on the data side, but also on that more holistic industry overview side. So very glad we could connect and glad you could join the show this week.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Eric. Have a great rest of your day.
And that's a wrap on another episode of Beyond the Show. Hope you enjoyed that conversation with Rick Maturo from BDSA. The whole price compression story really is fairly complicated. And as I said at the top of the episode, it kind of varies from state to state in terms of just how those price points are moving. The pricing pressure is pretty intense in a lot of these states, but it's also, you have markets in different states of development. So it's important to really zoom in on different state markets, like we did here briefly with Rick and over on CannabisBusinessTimes.com with a number of the features that we're running. And certainly like we're going to do at Cannabis Conference 2023. We are running the lowest rates of the season. If you're listening to this episode when it comes out, at least, we're going to be running those rates through March 15th. So make sure you check out CannabisConference.com to learn more about all the plans that are taking shape right now and all the announcements to come. Make sure you get signed up. Like I say, we know we're going to see you out in Vegas. Why don't you save some money along the way? Get yourself registered now. Get ready for Las Vegas. It's going to be a little hot out in August. Well aware of that. But we'll be nice and cool in the conference itself at the Paris. So check out CannabisConference.com. Sign up for the newsletter along the way. And I'll see you back here every Friday for Beyond the Show.